Hello, welcome to our virtual celebration of Bernando LaPallo's 125th birthday. My name is Erica, and I'm Bernando's oldest grandchild. It is now 7:02 Eastern Standard Time, and it's really a pleasure to be with you here today or this evening or whenever you're watching this, whether you're watching this here or on another platform. So, Bernando LaPallo, most of you who are subscribed know who he is, but for those who don't know who he is or was, he was a family man, he was an accomplished chef, he was a massage therapist, he was a doctor of podiatry, he was a natural health consultant, he was a reflexologist. He was well-traveled, he was an author, he was a lecturer. He was born on August 17th, which is today, 1901 in Vitória, Brazil, to Bernando LaPallo Sr., who was born in Brazil, and to an American mother named Maddie Carr. So they had migrated to Brazil after getting married and going there, and then that's where he was born, and then eventually he and his father would migrate back to the United States and eventually take up residence in Harlem. Bernando arrived in the United States around 1906. So he was about 5 years old when he arrived here, and eventually his father would set up a medical practice in Harlem on what is known now historically as being Stryver's Row. So, of course, so that's it in a nutshell. So Bernando was a very inspiring figure and continues to be an inspiring figure for people around the world, especially in these days and times, particularly in America, where our healthcare system is broken, very, very broken, and people have, kind of not been taught how to take care of their body, how to take care of their temple. Bernando saw the body as a sacred thing and that it should be taken care of like the temple. And he came to this conclusion because that's how he was raised and that's how he was taught by his own father, who was a medical doctor and also a root doctor, which today we would call an herbalist. So thank you for being here, and I just wanted to tell some stories today. Tell some stories that have been passed on to me by Bernando. I looked up to Bernando. He was like a father to me, even though I had a biological father. I was really close to him. And I wanted to share some of this stuff today just for fun. So this is going to be a super long celebration today. But if you were lucky enough to go to any of Bernando's birthday parties when he was living in Arizona, he lived in New York for 90 years and then he moved out to Arizona. It was quite the affair. So this, of course, is just a virtual affair. Me and you, one-on-one. So when I was looking through, my notes today and thinking about what I could share, a couple of memories came to mind and a synchronicity came to mind revolving around an old employer of Bernando's. So there was a very famous restaurant that actually had two locations. It was called McGinnis's, and they had a location at one time, around the Times Square area, but they also had another location in a part of Brooklyn known as Sheepshead Bay. So, of course, Sheepshead Bay, being a bay, had a direct connection with the Atlantic Ocean, and there was a time that New York was very, very rich in seafood. So as the story goes, as my grandfather relayed this story to me, Eventually, he would end up working at Sheepshead Bay location of McGinnis's, which was known, apparently it was known as being the roast beef king. But when my grandfather talked to me about it, he really talked a lot about the seafood. And the reason why he talked about the seafood was because there was a patron of McGinnis's who, in my knowledge, happened to be the owner of McGinnis's. Actually, the owner was the Luciano crime family, who was a mob boss whose name was Frank Costello. So Frank Costello has entered into the lore of the United States, particularly because a part of his physicality, his voice in particular, he was known to speak with a raspy voice like this, was immortalized in the movie The Godfather, that Marlon Brando played the Godfather Michael Corleone. And Marlon Brando, patterned his speech and patterned his voice after Frank Costello. So you can look this up. You can look it all up about the investigation into Frank Costello in the early 1950s, and you can hear Frank speak himself. So through a series of events, the Luciano crime family, Frank Costello, became the owner of this restaurant. The background to this, as my grandfather told me, was that the old man McGinnis, right, the owner of this restaurant, passed away, and the person who had inherited the responsibility for running the restaurant, at least the one that my grandfather spoke to me about that used to be in Manhattan, was his son. And his son was named Stanley. And Stanley didn't have any discipline because he was spoiled. His mother spoiled him a lot. I guess the dad didn't really have any say over that. And Stanley really didn't understand responsibility or managing money. And when he grew up, being in proximity to the Great White Way, being in proximity to Broadway, he spent probably a considerable allowance on partying, spending time with showgirls, drinking, spending his money in that way. And so when his father passed away, who had this very successful restaurant, he didn't know how to run it. He didn't know anything about responsibility at all. And so he just kept partying and kept doing all that, and then eventually got to the point where he ran out of money pretty quickly and one was unable to pay the staff of McGinnis's, right? The cooks, the waiters, all the people that make a restaurant run. And so somehow or another, the mob, right, offered to loan him the money so he could get it together, get back on his feet, and repay the debt. But that's not what happened. So apparently he defaulted on the loan. He defaulted on the loan at least once. As a matter of fact, I believe my grandfather told me he defaulted on the loan not once but twice. So he ended up borrowing money a second time and blew it. And so because of that, they said, sorry, boy, sorry, sonny, we're going to take over the restaurant now because you haven't been able to pay off the loan. So that's what ended up happening. So eventually, Bernando, who was an expert cook and who was very good at preparing seafood and steaks and all kinds of things, ended up working at the location in Queens in the 1950s. So as my grandfather told it to me, Frank Costello would come into the restaurant on a regular basis. And in addition to what they call steamers being a specialty of the restaurant, if anyone knows, that would be things like, oysters, right? because New York City used to be, and its environs used to be very, very rich in seafood. There used to be 1 billion to 2 billion oysters just in the New York harbor alone. And then in Long Island, right, Brooklyn and Long Island are actually part of the same landmass. We had mussels and clams and lobsters, anything that you could want in terms of seafood, flounder, all of these types of things. So my grandfather was very expert at preparing crab cakes. So when Frank would come into the restaurant, he'd say, I don't want anyone else touching my food. I only want Q touching my food. I don't want anyone else touching my food. So he would ask for the crab cakes, and Bernando would make them for him, and then he would personally bring them to the table for Frank, and then Frank, being well pleased, would pull out his billfold, and he would peel off $1, $2, $3, $400 bills, and he would hand them to Bernando, and he says, "Those are for your kids." So over time, a way to a man's heart is through his stomach. So over time, they became friendly. And one evening after dinner, Bernando hitched a ride with Frank, back into the city. And so, so they arrived at the Majestic. Now, the Majestic, in case you don't know, was, and it still exists, it's a very luxurious apartment building that is still located on Central Park West. The address of the building, okay, let me see, I wrote it down here. Of course, now it's on the other page. Okay, so the address of the Majestic, the address of the Majestic is, I believe, here it goes. It's at 115 Central Park West. And Frank and his wife had rented an apartment on the 18th floor. So they were an 18F, and apparently it was a very spacious apartment. It had at least 9 rooms in it. So they stopped there to drop off Frank first, and then, as is custom, cabbies would take more than one fare, and then you would continue on, and you would drop, the second passenger off at their home, and then the last person out of the cab would pay the fare. So Frank got out of the cab, and just a few moments later, bam, bam, you heard gunshots. Bernando heard gunshots. Now, there was an attempt made on Frank Costello's life on May 2nd, 1957. His rival, the rival crime family, was run by Luciano, the rival crime family was the Genovese crime family. So the acting boss of the Luciano crime family was Frank Costello, but his rival was Vito Genovese. So a guy named Chin Gigante was waiting for Frank in the lobby, the entranceway of the building. When he got there, took aim, took a shot. Frank fell to the floor, but by some miracle, the bullet only grazed Frank's head. He still had to go to the hospital, but it only grazed his head. So instead of the assassination attempt being successful, with the bullet going through his head, it was a messed up attempt. So meanwhile, my grandfather's in the cab. So as it was custom, it used to be when you would drop off a passenger with the cab, the person who was still in the cab, and sometimes even the cab driver, would wait until you entered the building. You would look through and you would see whether your friend, your companion in the cab ride, would get into the building safely. It's not like today where you just drop someone off and then you take off. So I said to my grandfather, "Oh my God." I said, "So what did you do? What did you do when you heard the gunshots?" He said, "I got the hell out of there." Now, of course, I had two thoughts here. The first thought is, well, wait a minute, that was your friend. That was your friend Frank. You just took off? But of course, when you think about this logically, his friend was the crime boss of the Luciano crime family. So Bernando put it together pretty quickly that there had been an attempt on his life and he really shouldn't stick around and he should get out of there. So I just wanted to share that story with you in case you hadn't heard it before, because there were, several times that Bernando came in contact with who would be considered, criminals during the course of his lifetime and during the course of his career. I remember him telling me that when he was earlier in his life, when he was living in Harlem, and he was well known, he was a friendly guy, everyone knew who he was. He was a very competent chef, he was a very competent cook, and back in the 30s and the 40s, and probably later than that, the mob, they invested in businesses. They wanted to make money. So they invested in restaurants, they invested in racetracks, they invested in nightclubs, right? Any place where they could make a killing on money, because people like to go out, people like to spend money, bootlegging, all of that type of stuff. They were involved in that business. And so Bernando came to their attention, and they had a meeting with him one day. They called him into a back room and had a meeting with him. And they offered to, sort of lend him the money, right, to open up his own place, to open up his own restaurant in his own place, because they could see that he had excellent social skills, that he was well-liked, that he was popular, and this is the kind of guy that they would love to have working really for him as a front. Because, if the mob was backing you in a business, you never really owned it free and clear. You were going to have to give them the lion's share of the profits. Everyone knew that. So I said to him, "What? Like, weren't you scared?" Because, of course, the portrayal of the mob, if you watch movies like, what is the name of that movie? So famous, with Sharon Stone, right? Sharon Stone, with the Robert De Niro in it, but also, I can't believe I'm forgetting the name of this movie right now. It was with Ray Liotta and Pesci, very famous movie. Write it in the comments if you can remember the movie I'm talking about right now. So, amongst themselves, my God, brutal, right? Brutal killings and all of that, and rivalries and jealousies and hurt feelings that ended up with someone getting a bullet in their head and, being buried. So this is my impression when Bernando was telling me this encounter that he had with these mob guys. So he said, "No, I wasn't scared." I was like, "Really?" He said, "Well, amongst themselves, they had rivalries and, they would kill each other and so on amongst themselves. But I wasn't worried about that because I wasn't in the mob." So I said, "Well, how did this meeting go down?" They made me an offer. They made me a proposition. We'll give you the money for your restaurant. And then they waited for his answer. His reply was, "No, thank you. I'm not interested in entering into a business relationship with you because if I do, I will never really own it. He said, I will enter a business relationship with you if you turn it over to me within 2 years. If you turn it over to me within 2 years and I own it free and clear, okay. But if not, I'm not interested. And so Bernando basically explained to them the terms of business, that he actually understood how a business would run. So anyone who's tried opening a restaurant or a cafe or anything like that, you know that it takes a couple of years or maybe even longer than that for you to put the expenses behind you of opening it, meeting your operating costs, which of course include paying a staff before you're out of the red, you're free and clear, and you actually can make a profit. So he just explained all of this to them very calmly, very respectfully, very firmly. And I said, my God, well, what happened? And he said, they listened to me, and then they said they realized, oh, he's too smart. We don't want to do business with him because he's too smart. So the offer was withdrawn. I thought this was amazing. So this is just one of so many examples of how Bernando was able to hold his own, regardless of whom he was speaking to and whatever topic they were speaking about. He had no fear. He had no fear, and he always treated everyone with respect. So the mob may have been disappointed that Bernando wasn't going to enter into business with him, but there was no animosity, there was no hard feelings, and there was no trying to strong arm him into entering a business relationship with him. Amazing. They understood that having a black man who was a resident of Harlem, who grew up in Harlem, who was well liked in Harlem, would be to their advantage in terms of business. But Bernando was smart enough to understand that he didn't want to be a pawn and a middleman in someone else's game, because once you enter into a relationship like that, there's no getting out of it. You can never get out of it. So that was that story. Now, what I found to be even more incredible about this chapter of Bernando, again, working at McGinnis's, is that I have a friend named Barry Schwartz. Barry Schwartz was born in New York. He grew up in Brooklyn, and he's considerably older than me, Barry. Barry is about, let's see, I'm 63. Barry is in his 70s. Barry is well into his 70s now. And he remembers going to McGinnis's in Sheepshead Bay, Brooklyn, when he was a kid. He and his family would go there because the seafood was excellent, and as he explained it to me, they would go there for steamers. So anyone who's had, mussels, oysters, any kind of seafood like that, you steam that lightly before eating it. And so that's what he would go for. So we got into this random conversation a few months back, and I said, wait a minute, I didn't know you went to McGinnis's. And he said, well, didn't I tell you that before? And then I had to really think about it. And I said, yeah, I guess you did tell me about that before. You told me that somewhere around 2015, when I was actually moving from Brooklyn to go live with my grandfather in Tempe, Arizona, because my grandfather had requested my presence. So I gave up everything here in Brooklyn and I moved out there. And I said, yeah, I guess you did tell me, but it just didn't it just didn't register. It didn't compute because it just seems so, how shall I say, almost unbelievable to me that somehow we would be that closely intertwined, you know, over such a large span of time. Because when my grandfather was working in McGinnis's, he was, at the time that the attempt was made on Frank Costello's life in 1957, that means my grandfather would have been working there when he was 56 years old. So if Barry explained to me, you know, he was going there when he was a child, so he was going there, you know, when he was about 6 years old, right? Around that age. Those are the memories that he had. Maybe a little bit later than that, but around that time. So this just blew my mind. So then I took out a photo of Bernando from around this time period, because I've got a very kind of wrinkled up old ID photo, right, that you used to have from, you know, Bernando's belongings, something that he just held on to. Quite handsome, I might add. So I said, is this the man you remember? And he said, without a doubt, without a doubt. So he remembers Bernando coming out of the kitchen to go into the dining area where the patrons would be sitting to serve someone. So this was definitely something that Bernando, you know, would do from time to time, because he was such a good cook and he was so personable and he genuinely enjoyed cooking and he genuinely enjoyed feeding people, that sometimes he would do things like that. Or sometimes people would say, you know, I want to thank the chef. So it used to be the custom that if you wanted to thank the chef, that the waiter would go back into the kitchen and tell the chef, you know, tell the cook that someone wanted to thank them personally. And, you know, they would come out and there would be kind of pleasantries and thanks and, you know, that exchange. I don't know if people do this anymore, but when I was growing up, this would happen. And it was always very heartwarming. So I just thought that was amazing that happened, because this is, you know, a real validation of history. So sometimes, you know, when we're listening to history, we doubt history and people doubt oral history. But if any of you have been lucky enough to have grandparents and be able to sit and listen to them talk about their memories of when they were growing up, or what their working life was like, or what they used to do for fun and recreation, or the hardships that they went through, you know, you understand what I'm talking about and how important it is to listen to these types of stories, how meaningful it is, and how it shapes our perceptions and our worldview. So, the last thing that I wanted to mention about, and I'm going to put a link into this bit of history for you, is that my grandfather was telling me that he used to go to a place called Creole Pete's, and that Creole Pete's was an after-hours place that was a restaurant, basically in an apartment, like an apartment building. And that one night he went, and Benny Goodman was up in there having a jam session with some chorus girls, and they were just having fun. Now remember, this is Harlem, right? So this would have been about 1938. Now, I'm saying that because I thought, wait a minute, let me look up who this Creole Pete was. Is there any history about this guy named Creole Pete? Because the history of Harlem is fairly well documented, because of the Harlem Renaissance, because of all the music that happened up in Harlem, right? We had Duke Ellington, we had Count Basie, we had Cab Calloway, we had Ella Fitzgerald, we had Fats Waller, we had all the rent parties, we had, you know, the Flappers, we had the Lafayette Theater, we had so many things going up in Harlem culturally that it is pretty well documented. So today I went ahead and did a little internet search about Creole Pete. And I discovered that Creole Pete was a former baseball player. He used to play the position of catcher for Satchel Paige in the Negro Leagues. That he was originally from New Orleans. And he decided to transplant himself up to Harlem because he saw an opportunity there. And he ended up, you know, sort of opening this kind of, you know, underground backroom restaurant called Creole Pete's that everyone would go to right after work, because where do the people who entertain everyone else go to after hours? Well, they go to after hours places. And I looked it up and I found this whole history about him and how he and Louis Armstrong were friends. Because guess what? Louis Armstrong was from New Orleans. So you had these two New Orleans guys that were up in Harlem. And of course, Louis Armstrong would also frequent Creole Pete's to have some cooking, right, that was familiar to him from his hometown of New Orleans. So now I'm starting to make more connections, right, because now I'm not sure exactly when they became friends, but Bernando and Louis Armstrong also became friends. Now this might have been actually earlier, and I've talked about this before. I've talked about Bernando studying cooking in Paris, and he and Louis, you know, meeting up there. I've talked about that before, but now this adds another layer to the history. So apparently Creole Pete, oh my God, okay, so apparently Creole Pete would eventually open up a legitimate place at 2700 7th Avenue. So that is about between 151st Street and 152nd Street up in Harlem. It no longer exists. I looked it up on maps, on Google Maps, and it seems as if where Creole Pete's used to be, seems like they knocked all those buildings down, and now there's apartment buildings there. There's projects there. Interestingly enough, though, not far from there, on 150th Street, between 7th Avenue and Frederick Douglass Boulevard, there is a Bill Bojangles Park. So now that's funny, and that's interesting to me, because grandfather told me the story of how he went to Creole Pete's, and that there was somewhere in a back room, there was a card game going on, and that somehow Bernando ended up there with his kitchen boy, right? Again, Bernando was a cook and a chef, and when you work in a restaurant, different people have different positions. And so this kitchen boy, whose name I don't know, apparently was engaged in a card game with Bill Bojangles Robinson, who apparently was quite the gambler. And the kitchen boy actually won the game, but Bill Bojangles, feeling entitled, you know, he was known as the mayor of Harlem at one point, he's basically made a move to keep all the money. So this angered Bernando, and he said, you know, basically, get your hands off that money. It belongs to him, not to you. Who do you think you are? You think just because you're, you know, the mayor of Harlem that you can steal like this? If you don't get your hands off the money, I'm going to shoot you. So, now, the other person, I guess, apparently, that had gone with Bernando to this venue said, no, Q, no, don't do that, Q, don't do that, Q. Now, my grandfather didn't get angry very often. Now, around this time period of 1938, Bernando would have been about somewhere between 36 and 37 years old. So apparently, you know, he was talked out of doing such a thing, and I guess Bill Bojangles Robinson turned over the money. But I remember my grandfather saying to me with indignation, I knew him. I knew him. He was my kitchen boy. I knew him. So there you have it. So I just wanted to tell some of these stories because a lot of people have the impression that Bernando was like a goody two-shoes. He wasn't a goody two-shoes. I mean, he wasn't a bad man, but he certainly was a man who knew how to stand his ground. So here we have a few different stories, right, where he's friends with the mob boss, Frank Costello, where there's an assassination attempt on his life after he gets out of a cab in a shared taxi ride that he and Bernando were taking home, ostensibly, maybe perhaps returning from McGinnis's. Then another story where Bernando was holding his own, where some mobsters that were running businesses up in Harlem wanted him to be the front man, where he politely declined and explained his reasons for doing so, not nervous, not shaken at all, coming out of that unscathed. And then the corroboration historically of a real Creole Pete from New Orleans who was friends with Louis Armstrong, who Bernando was friends with Louis Armstrong, who eventually opened up a legitimate restaurant at 2700 7th Avenue because apparently Creole Pete, or Mr. Robinson, was starting to be squeezed by the cops who wanted him to pay them off, you know, so as not to squeal on him, and he wasn't interested in that. So he ended up opening a legitimate restaurant. So I just wanted to tell you some of these stories in celebration of Bernando's, what would have been his 125th birthday today on August 17th of 2026. Now, originally, Bernando had the intention of living to be 120 years old, partly because he just wanted to do it, right? It was just something he wanted to do. There's actually a really nice interview of him. There used to be a club called the 120 Club, and these were people whose goal was to live to be at least 120 years old. And I'm going to try and find the clip for you and put it in the links in the comments here so you can just see this conversation. I've only been able to find a portion of it. I have the impression that it was a much longer interview, but so far what I've been able to find on YouTube is just a portion of it. So when Grandpa would talk to me or mention to me sometimes about longevity, you know, he would bring up Methuselah. So for those of you who are Christians, for those of you who are familiar with the Bible, right, there's a whole story of Methuselah and how long he lived. So that was kind of Bernando's goal. Of course, he made it to 114. I would imagine that if Bernando hadn't suffered the loss of his oldest daughter, the grief really got to him. He survived so many things, but one thing that he really, really could not deal with was the loss of his oldest daughter. And he was gone within, let's see, my mother died in 2014. So that was in Bernando's 113th year, and he was gone by 114. I only saw my grandfather really, age between 112 and 114. As a matter of fact, I didn't even see him for that year because remember, in the series that I did before, we had a big birthday celebration for him at the Slipper Room in New York City, just weeks away from his 112th birthday, right? So after he lost his daughter, he really became quite reclusive. He didn't go out. He told me that he didn't want to go out because people would ask him about her, and that just kind of sent him, just kind of spiraling. He was very, very, very depressed, and he just didn't want to talk about it. He preferred to grieve on his own. Now, this is extraordinary because Bernando lost his first wife in childbirth. His first child was a boy whose name was Philip, right? His nickname was Peña. He was a musician. He survived that. Then he got married a second time, right? That marriage ended up dissolving. He had 2 children out of that marriage. He survived his second wife. He got his first wife died in childbirth. His second wife, my maternal grandmother, that marriage ended up in divorce. So that was 2 marriages. And then his third marriage to Georgette, he outlived her. So she ended up passing away around the time that Grandpa was about 108 years old. That was very stressful for him, and he did have a mild stroke, but he did end up recovering from the stroke because of the acupuncture and the massage that he did. He understood that it was a circulatory problem, and he worked on that and took care of that. And then he managed to live another 5 years, right? So, I think that if that personal loss wouldn't have occurred, that he probably could have made it to 120. I think, he could have at least had another 2-3 more good years with him, with his lifespan. He actually told me a few days before he crossed over, before he died, that he and my mother had plans, that he was actually planning on leaving Arizona and returning to Paris to go live back in France, as he used to say it with her. He didn't really see any point in, being there in Arizona, by himself anymore, and he enjoyed France, and she was there and enjoyed her company. He's like, oh yeah, we had plans, you didn't know anything about it. I was like, wow. So I guess I'll just leave you with the thought that, age less, live more, because Bernando's parting statement, every time he would do a lecture would be to say, I'm making plans to live. I know I gotta die sometime, but I'm making plans to live. So I hope that you enjoyed this little virtual celebration. Thank you so much for being here with me. I would love it if you made a comment below. Maybe you have a question. Subscribe, share this. And until the next time, remember to keep your liver and your colon clean. If you haven't picked up Bernando's book, Age Less, Live More, Achieving Health and Vitality at 107 years and beyond, I highly recommend you do so. It's a wonderful book. Also, there's Beyond 100, How to Live Well Until Your Second Century, which is inspirational. Get those books, gift them to someone, and I Thank you very much for being here, and thank you so much for the birthday wishes, Jujar Singh Bhatti. Thank you so much. You're always so kind. Okay. Good night, everyone.